Okay, so I will first inform you about what motivated us to do this research. Of course, there are the challenge you are very well aware of. The climate changes are not something that will happen in the future, but that are already occurring right now. Yeah, so we are already almost at a threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius higher temperatures compared to pre-industrial times. And that's much earlier than was previously expected. And lots of NGOs and also finance-related NGOs call upon both public and commercial institutions to provide climate finance to address these challenges. And in this presentation, we will especially zoom in on the so-called MDBs, the Multilateral Development Banks, and the most famous or notorious, on your perspective, might be the World Bank, but we also have several regional development banks, multilateral development banks, the Asian Development Bank, the European Investment Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the African Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank. These are the multilateral development banks that are studied in this paper. So climate finance, this is a thinky diagram of the landscape of climate finance in a recent past, showing the sources of these funds. And in blue, you see the public finances, and in orange, it is the private money. And this is about 50-50. So far, about half of the funding is from public institution and the other half is from private institution. And they use several instruments to get this funding to the users. And the use is shown that most of the use is for mitigation. Think in terms of renewable energy projects. That is the most important use, but also improving the efficiency of power plants. That is another mitigation strategy. And for adaptation, there is limited funds available, less than 10% of the overall funding provided in this period. And the sector where does the money land? It shows that most of the money lands in energy systems and transport, and relatively limited in land use, in infrastructure, in industry, and water and waste. Now, so the focus in this presentation is about public funding and the uses for adaptation and mitigation. And in particular, we zoom in on these multilateral development banks, which make up about 10% of the total climate finance. Now, 10% doesn't sound that much, but you should realize that the multilateral development banks often are leading regarding innovative financial instruments, and also they are act as more as a signal for other parties that it is a good project. So often, if their multilateral development banks provide funding, then also commercial institutions are willing to accompany this with some of their funding. Okay, so the multilateral development banks, part of their business is providing climate finance. And if we look into where this money lands, it appears that this is relatively concentrated. So we have 5 countries taking up 1/3 of all the climate finance in the recent past. That is India, Turkey, China, Poland, and Argentina combined take up 30% of the climate funding. And the funding is focusing on 2 issues in particular, that is mitigating, reducing carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas emissions, and reducing countries' vulnerability to climate change. So adaptation and mitigation. These are the objectives of climate finance by the multilateral development banks. So worldwide, what is the de facto distribution of carbon dioxide emissions. So we focus on emerging and developing countries and leave out the OECD countries mainly. So we are not discussing US, Canada, and the European Union, Australia. So most of the emissions in our sample of 140 countries is in Asia and Latin America. These countries produce most of the carbon dioxide emissions. If we look into the vulnerability, it shows that especially African countries are vulnerable. And for vulnerability, we use the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index. And that is an index that measures the predisposition of societies to be negatively impacted by climate hazards. And they look into the exposure to these hazards, to the sensitivity, and to the adaptive capacity of societies. And in particular, they're concerned with the exposure sensitivity and adaptation capacity regarding water, health, food, ecosystem services, human habitats, and infrastructure. That's how this Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index is being constructed. For carbon dioxide emissions, we use the Global Carbon Project data for emissions at the country level. Now, this right-hand part of the slide shows where the climate finance actually lands. And that is, as I said, that's highly concentrated. And we see that India, Turkey, Argentina, China, and Poland receive a large chunk of this funding, and also several other Asian and Latin American countries. Now we want to map climate finance with countries' actual carbon dioxide emissions and their vulnerabilities. And to do so, we have divided the world in two, so to speak. And the division is, the cut is the median emissions and the median vulnerability. So the median emissions is 8.6 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions, and the median vulnerability of the country sample is 4.445 on the Notre Dame Gain Index. So this shows that we can have four groups. We can have high emissions, high vulnerability, high emissions, low vulnerability, low emissions, low vulnerability, and low emissions, high vulnerability. Now, it shows that for the high emissions, low vulnerability countries, we have 1.6 billion being allocated to these. We have for the high emissions, high vulnerability countries, we have 1.6 million being allocated. Then for the low emissions, low vulnerability, there is a relatively small amount of fund being allocated, and also 169 million is going to the low emissions, high vulnerability countries. So this shows that the world map according to the high or low vulnerability and high or low emissions. Now, then we want to find out about efficiency. So, as economists, we are really interested in the efficient allocation of money. And efficiency in this context is in fact a ratio of climate finance over the mitigation and adaptation needs of countries. And we have proxied the mitigation and adaptation needs by their emissions and their vulnerability. Now, in the context of this paper, efficient allocation in fact implies that two countries with identical carbon emissions and vulnerability receive the same amount of carbon finances. And there is a higher efficiency score when given that emissions and vulnerability held constant, and multilateral development banks provides more climate finance to such countries. So So climate finance is efficient if it's in proportion to a country's emissions and vulnerability. Now, just to give an idea, I show here that we think that low emissions, low vulnerability countries would not be, it would not be fair if they receive lots of money. So the money should go especially to the countries which are highly vulnerable and or have high emissions. So then the allocation would look like this in this panel. However, if we look into climate allocation, how it's going in practice, we see that most of the money is being allocated to high emissions, low vulnerability countries, and relatively little in particular to low emissions, high vulnerability countries. So there is the biggest difference with the, say, the ideal picture on the left-hand side is that high emissions, low vulnerability countries get much more funding for climate projects than low emissions, high vulnerability. So much more money is being allocated for mitigation than for adaptation. So we find also, therefore, highly skewed efficiency scores. So ideally, the score would be, say, between 0.8 and 1, but we see that there's a very unequal distribution of this climate funding, and we can label that as not very inefficient. And so the uneven distribution of the climate finance being provided by World Bank and the likes is not efficient from an allocational point of view. And that's because much more is going to mitigation than to adaptation. Okay, so that is what's going on. And then we, of course, are interested, okay, what would happen if we would rebalance these funds? And therefore, it's important to know how the different key factors relate to one each other. And we've done so with the correlation coefficient, and showing that the mitigation finance highly correlates with carbon dioxide emissions, highly correlates with countries' GDP, and also correlates positively with adaptation finance. However, we see that adaptation finance also positive correlates with carbon dioxide emissions, but not, in fact, zero with the vulnerability index. And that's really disturbing, because one should realize that this adaptation finance is meant to support resilience and to reduce vulnerability. So that is really a concern that, so for mitigation finance, the relation is as we would expect. There's a significant and positive correlation with carbon dioxide emissions, but with adaptation finance, we don't find any correlation with the vulnerability index. So that brings us to look into the future, so to speak, and think how rebalancing the current allocation of climate finance could be changed, and what would be the impact on carbon emissions and on vulnerability. Now, you should realize, of course, there's always a trade-off. And so the amount of funding that is available by these multilateral development banks is limited. And yeah, they can either spend it on mitigation or on adaptation. Ideally, and what is really required, given that there's a huge gap to finance all this, the climate, the economic and social challenges put upon by climate change, and there's a huge gap. So ideally you would want to have much more climate finance available, but that is another topic we research. Here we look into the allocational efficiency of the current, of the existing climate finance, and what would happen if one would change this allocation. So you should realize that now for the climate funding provided by the multilateral development banks, it is 70% is going to mitigation projects and 30% for adaptation projects. Now, that is in huge contrast with the commercial climate finance, where about 95% of the funding is for mitigation and just 5% for adaptation. Now, if you want to achieve a transition, we label it as a transition scenario where the distribution would be equal, 50% for adaptation and 50% for mitigation. And then we come up with a very ambitious scenario regarding 60% of the climate finance for adaptation and 40% for mitigation. Now, ideally, of course, if we would have enough time, one would say, well, adaptation is not that important. We need to reduce carbon emissions as soon as possible. Yeah, that's correct. But we should realize that climate change already is going on. There are several, every day there are situations where communities, countries are already exposed and are highly sensitive to the climate change that is going on. So we don't have this time, and we need to assure that these societies, that the countries are being supported to become resilient and flexible regarding this climate change because of the unequal distribution of vulnerability and emissions on the planet I've shown earlier on. So basically, these are the different scenarios we play around with. The basic scenario where the distribution of climate funding would change, the transition scenario where there's a equal distribution, and the so-called ambitious scenario where where climate funding will be skewed towards adaptation. So, to recap, vulnerability is meant to improve countries' adaptation capacity and reduce their sensitivity to climate change, requiring adaptation finance, and mitigation finance is focused on reducing carbon dioxide emissions. Hence, as our renewable energy projects or energy efficiency projects. Okay, what would happen in the basic scenario? And we look until the year 2050. Well, in the basic scenario, the emissions would increase to 38 gigatons, and vulnerability would slightly reduce to the Jane index of 0.447, meaning that vulnerability would reduce by 3.6%, and the emissions in this basic scenario increase with 63%. Now, then we come up with the transition scenario and the ambitious scenario. In the transition scenario, we have a 50-50 distribution, and there we see that the emissions increase to 38.9 gigatons, and the vulnerability on average reduces to 0.431. And that's the same in the ambitious scenario, but you should look into the how this line moves. With the ambitious scenario, the curve goes, what happens is that the reduction is already taking on much earlier on in the process. And then we have the another version of the ambitious scenario, 60-40, which results in emissions of 39.3 gigatons and vulnerability dropping to 0.423. That meaning that the vulnerability is reduced by 8.6%, and carbon dioxide emissions increase by almost 69%. So if you compare the ambitious scenario and the transition scenario with the basic scenario, you will see that the vulnerability given our scenarios is much better. So the vulnerability reduces stronger, and the emissions carbon dioxide emissions they grow more. And why is that? That's because funds that are used for adaptation projects cannot, of course, be used for mitigation projects. And that is pointing out already that there is a climate funding gap. So that's the bottom line of our modeling. So what happens for people? So this shows the impact of rebalancing on the population. And so this, on the left-hand side, panel A, we have the vulnerability of countries in 2017. And here we have, in red is above the mean vulnerability, and in orange is below the mean vulnerability of the countries. Now, under the basic scenario, that's panel B, you will see that in 2050, only a few countries move from above mean vulnerability to below mean vulnerability. So in 2017, we have 83 countries higher than average vulnerability, and that is 74 countries higher than average vulnerability. So 9 migrated from above to below average vulnerability. Now, look what's happened in our transition scenario. So panel B here shows the vulnerability in 2050 under the basic scenario, and panel C shows the vulnerability in the same year if we have the transition scenario. So that shows that under transition scenario, you see much less countries in red, let's say especially in the South Asian area, and also in Africa, countries moved from above to below average vulnerability. So in panel B, we have 74 countries in red, and in panel C, we have 52 countries in red. So to compare the two scenarios, we have that 22 countries moved from above to below average. Now, then in the ambitious scenario, so again, we start with with panel C, the left-hand side, what was the vulnerability under this transition scenario? And when we move to the vulnerability under the most ambitious scenario, again, we see a drop in the number of countries that are above average vulnerability. And so we had in transition scenario, we had 52 countries above average, and in the right-hand panel, we have still 30 countries in red. So again, we have a migration from above to below average, and that translates into 7.5% of global population. So not only in terms of Andy Jane score or carbon dioxide emission, but it really has a material impact on many, many people's lives if we would change from the basic scenario to an ambitious scenario. In fact, that means that 2.5 billion people, more than 2.5 billion people, would see the vulnerability substantially improve. Okay, so the nature of the climate crisis is, that has been discussed in previous energy cafes. And so the interaction between the ecosystem, the social system, and economics and finance is part of the social system in climate change. And we focus on the rebalancing of climate change. So the basic scenario is business as usual, saying 30% adaptation, 70% mitigation. But we can move to a transition scenario where adaptation and mitigation are seen as equally important. And that would mean a big increase in adaptation finance and a reduction in mitigation finance. And we could be even more ambitious, where we put priority in helping reduce the vulnerability of a huge part of population on planet Earth. Okay, that was the conclusion of my presentation, and eager to hear your comments and questions, please.